Hello and welcome back to The Queer Protagonist. My name is Sam, and I believe that by sharing your story, you can help light someone's path a few steps forward. This episode means so much to me. I think it's one of the most important things that we need to be talking about right now, so I really hope that everyone listens, all my friends, family, coworkers, anyone and everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen because I think this message is so important to pay attention to listen to gain empathy and compassion about, to gain awareness of, and here you are. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and be here. I want to start today's episode with a quote by Emma Stone. We love Emma. She says, "If you knew everyone's story, you would love them." We'll pause the quote there. Do you believe that about you? That if someone knew your story, they would love you, they would better understand you? Emma continues, "You can't really hate anyone if you know everything that happened to them between their birth and now. Why they became the way they became. Why they have walls up or down. If you truly know someone, you'd get it." And wow, that quote rings so true. It's like if someone was in my shoes and they experienced everything that I've gone through, I'd really hope that they would love me because of it, that they would see that I've just been trying my best to navigate this wild thing that is life. And so I want you to keep that as the backbone as you're listening to this episode. In this episode, we will be talking about the urgent need for trans advocacy. My goal with this episode is to invite and urge everyone listening to strengthen our advocacy for the trans community, to stand in solidarity with them as an unprecedented number of attacks aim to eradicate them. I will spend a few minutes talking about why it's our responsibility to advocate for the trans community, standing in solidarity with them, and then I'll highlight some of the devastating legislation that has recently been passed or is currently on the docket. And now let's start with what's just happened, what's weighing really heavy on my mind. Just 2 weeks ago, at the Conservative Political Action Conference in the United States, political commentator Michael Knowles called for the eradication of quote-unquote transgenderism. This is what he said. "Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. There can be no middle way in dealing with transgenderism. It is all or nothing." Whew, okay. At the end of the day, there's no separation between the eradication of quote-unquote transgenderism from an attack on transgender people. It's not something that can be separated. They're one and the same. If we were to make similar remarks about eradicating Judaism or eradicating Christianity or promoting all or nothing for homosexuality, it would be clear that this message has murderous intent. This kind of story would have earned a front page headline in every newspaper around the world. Even if he's not inciting literal physical violence like he later claimed, he's still expressing a desire for a world where trans people cannot openly and authentically live. He went so far as to threaten to make the United States a hostile and uninhabitable place for trans people, forcing them to either remain in hiding or leave altogether. His words echo the sentiment of a hateful, violent attack on the trans community. Trans people, both kids and adults, are under attack in every aspect of their lives, from physical violence to legislative and social discrimination. We are just a few months into 2023 right now, and the Human Rights Campaign is tracking a whopping 430 anti-LGBTQ bills through the United States right now, about 180 of which target transgender people. Libby Gonzalez, a 12-year-old transgender student in Texas, said, "It really feels like my legislators want everyone to believe that kids like me don't really exist. They keep trying to convince everyone that I'm some kind of scary monster or that I have something wrong with me." Libby is one of 300,000 youth between the ages of 13 and 17 in the United States that identify as trans. She's also part of a larger group of young adults. A study found that 5.1% of adults younger than 30 in the United States identify as trans or non-binary, with 2% identifying as a trans man or woman and 3% identifying as non-binary. As for adults, a 2022 study estimated that about 0.5% of all U.S. adults, or approximately 1.3 million people, are trans. Total, that's about 1.6 million people in the United States right now that identify as trans. I'd like to tell you a story. In 2021, I went to the Encircle home in Provo, Utah, and met a few of the most loving, kind trans youth. If you haven't heard of the Encircle home, it's so beautiful. It was founded by Stephanie Larson, and it provides a safe, affirming, wonderful place that LGBTQ plus kids and young adults can go to for making friends, for having a place to go after school, do arts and crafts, for group friendship sessions. They also provide affirming therapy. It's an incredibly loving place. And so I went there for the first time in 2021, and I learned that part of the reason why Encircle exists is because many trans youth are not safe or welcome in their own homes. So Encircle provides them that safe space to spend time after school and on many weekends. If you didn't know, in K through 12 settings, 78% of trans people experience harassment. Kindergarten through 12th grade, 78% of trans people. Additionally, fewer than 1 in 3 transgender and non-binary young people find their home to be gender affirming. This is from the Trevor Project. And of the 1.6 million youth that are homeless each year, 40% of those homeless youth identify as LGBTQ+. And it's important to note, LGBTQ+ youth only represent about 7% of the total youth population. So this is a staggering proportion. I want to allow this podcast to be a place of psychological safety, place of compassionate learning, because a few years ago, I was in a completely different place than I am now. A little bit of context about me, if you didn't already know. I grew up in a conservative household in rural farm towns in Idaho and Washington. And in these communities, it was very plainly shared the beliefs about LGBTQ plus people. That, put simply, they're confused, that they are wrong, that they are not going to find happiness as they are unless they change themselves to fit the heteronormative mold, that they are in need of saving, in need of repenting. In 2019, I finally came to a place of peace in my own queer coming out journey as a gay man. It had been many years of trying to understand myself, learning to accept my own queerness, having grown up in a religion that told me that my queerness was wrong. At this point of self-acceptance, my eyes started to open to the rest of the LGBTQ plus community. I learned that I didn't really know very much about the trans community. But over the last 3 years, I have tried really hard to put myself in a place of learning and listening to learn more about the LGBTQ plus community, specifically from the trans community. And nothing has been more life-changing. Now, as a disclaimer, I want to make it clear that I am in no way a perfect ally, and I have made and will continue to make mistakes. However, my one intention is to support the trans community and to raise awareness about the importance of everyone doing so. Because, as the LGBTQ plus activist and author Adam Ely says in his book, The New Queer Conscience, which I love, he says this: "Queer people anywhere are responsible for queer people everywhere. After all, wouldn't you want someone to fight for you?" That resonates so deeply with me. Trans people have been at the forefront of fighting for LGBTQ plus rights, for our protection, for our safety, and for our liberation. And I believe that we should all stand up for each other, and especially right now. In conversations about trans allyship, I've had a few friends say to me, "I want to be a better advocate for the trans community, but I really just don't know what to do, or what to say, or where I stand. I want to be more loving, but I just don't quite understand. There's a lot that I don't know." If you come from a background like I did, growing up in a very conservative rural town, not really knowing any people who are trans, then it's time for us to open our horizons. The very first thing that you can do is get to know the trans community better. As of 2022, in the United States, 44% of people know a person who is trans, and 20% of people know someone who is non binary. Although this is an increase, as it was just 37% in 2017, we still have a long way to go. There are still so many people, about 56% of people in the US, that don't know a trans person, and they often act from fear. Maybe you have a friend or family member or a colleague who is trans, non binary, or gender non-conforming, and you really don't even know where to start. I know from personal experience that the greatest gift you can give LGBTQ plus people is affirmation and understanding. There are so many incredible trans people that share their voices and stories now for us to learn, and the least we can do is listen. The resource that I would strongly recommend is from the Trevor Project. It's online. It's called The Guide to Becoming an Ally to Transgender and Non-Binary Young People. And this is a great entry point. I'll link it in the show notes and in my IG bio. From my personal experience, the more I've learned about trans people over the last few years in personal friendships and from public voices, the more and more I've learned about the bravery, strength, and authenticity that trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people have. I believe that they are the strongest, bravest, and most free of all of us. From people like Monroe Bergdorf to Laverne Cox, Alok Menon, Jonathan Van Ness to Nikki Hiltz, Dylan Mulvaney to Eldoran, I am just so grateful that they share their story and create a more beautiful world just by existing. If you come from a religious background like I do, then I want to clear up a misconception. I think it's one of the most damaging misconceptions of today that supporting LGBTQ plus people is incompatible with Christianity or a belief in God. I think it's the exact opposite. I think that if you truly follow Jesus' example of loving everyone, being your brother's keeper, and treating others as you would like to be treated, you would fight against hate with all your might. Jesus consistently supported those who didn't fit in. I think that Jesus is the ultimate ally to the trans community. However, if your institution actively harms, invalidates, or attacks trans people, then it stands in complete opposition to Jesus' teachings. Just to sum this up, I believe that every single person listening right now has an ongoing responsibility to learn about the trans community and the issues that they face, and that we need to use our privilege and platforms to amplify trans voices and stand in solidarity with them. Now let's transition the podcast into some key legislation to be aware of. On Thursday, March 16th, so just a few days ago, Florida became the latest state in the U.S. to put into effect their ban of gender-affirming care for young trans people. Already this year, 4 states, including Mississippi, Tennessee, South Dakota, and Utah, have passed these gender-affirming care bans into law, and 27 other states are currently considering similar bans. To this, Catherine Oakley of the Human Rights Campaign said, "Medical decisions are best left to medical experts and parents or guardians, not politicians without an ounce of medical training, acting as if they know how to raise and support our children better than we do." We'll pause there. So you might ask yourself to that quote, what do medical experts have to say? What does the data say? The truth is that data from more than a dozen studies of more than 30,000 transgender and gender diverse young people consistently shows that access to gender-affirming care is associated with better mental health outcomes, and that lack of access to such care is associated with higher rates of suicidality, depression, and self-harming behavior. This research is well backed from major medical organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and many others. If you look at the research, all of these medical societies have found this care to be medically necessary and evidence-based. For example, a 2022 study showed that youth who received gender-affirming medications, including puberty blockers or gender-affirming hormones, had 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality over those first 12 months compared with youth who did not get such medication. Now, this week in Kentucky, the Senate passed a bill that does 3 things specifically. First, it bans gender-affirming care, prohibiting these trans youth from accessing this best practice, age-appropriate medical care. Even after careful consultation with the young person, their parents, and doctors, it also forces the doctors to detransition trans youth who have been receiving and thriving under their care. Second, this bill forces teachers to disclose confidential conversations that they've had with their students about their sexual orientation or gender identity to the student's parents, even if that would put the student in danger at home. And third, this bill bans transgender students from using school restrooms and locker rooms that match their gender identity. To this, Catherine Oakley, who is the state legislative director for the HRC, said, "This bill would terrorize transgender youth in schools, in doctors' offices, and even put them in danger at home." And we'll just pause there for a second. It's worth noting that in the last year, nearly half of LGBTQ plus youth in Kentucky seriously considered suicide. Alarmingly, nearly 1 in 4 trans and non-binary youth in the state made a suicide attempt. I want to read to you the rest of what Catherine said. Let's be clear. These extremist legislators do not care about passing good public policy. They do not care about abiding by the rules. They do not care that they are harming vulnerable children. And they certainly do not care about parental rights. This is simply a cruel attempt to stigmatize, marginalize, and erase the LGBTQ plus community, particularly transgender youth. Shame on them. Of the 428 anti-LGBTQ plus bills that are currently tracking across the U.S., you'll see that 7 states have introduced bills to ban trans students from using their correct pronouns. 8 states have introduced bills allowing teachers to misgender trans students. And this doesn't even scratch the surface of the bills that are currently on the docket. Ultimately, it is just so sad to me that this is even happening, that trans youth are being targeted so much when all this energy could go to somewhere else, anything else. Chris Hartman, who is the executive director of the Fairness Campaign, this is what he said. "The majority party has spent more time debating anti-trans laws this session than addressing childhood poverty, housing insecurity, and disaster relief combined. The blood of traumatized transgender children will be on their hands, and they'll be judged harshly by our history and our future generations." Then, speaking to the bill in Kentucky, he continues, "But make no mistake, LGBTQ plus Kentuckians will not back down, will not be forced back into the closet, and will not be erased. We are stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before." At the end of the day, I think that it's just so important to realize that these legislative attacks are not just words. They create a very dangerous, real-world environment for trans people. So, what can we do as advocates with the trans community? In next week's episode, I'm going to talk about 5 actionable steps that we can take for trans advocacy, which have been given by trans people themselves. I want to amplify the voices of trans people with action steps that we can take and the positive impact that we can make together. I'm also super excited that over the next couple weeks, a few of my friends who are trans will be hopping on the podcast. And I'm so excited for us to get to know these individuals better and to share more of these beautiful stories and voices. To end our episode with our queer quote, we'll end with this answer from Alok Vaidmenon, who is a gender nonconforming poet, activist, author, and much more. And they are actually one of my biggest role models. They were asked this question: what does trans and or non-binary joy look like to you? To which they responded, "Our existence, our very existence, is glorious and scintillating, such that they attempt to pass hundreds of laws to extinguish our flame. It took me a long time to realize it, but I'm finally here. They hunt precisely because of our joy. Our joy is world-making." That's the end of the quote. I just want to say thank you so much for listening. You are so loved. Remember to be kind to yourself and to others. Love ya!